In today's video, I'm going to show you what your camera settings in the studio mean and the fact that they're not quite as important as you think they are. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here, and I love studio lighting. I love teaching about studio lighting, and there's one question I get asked all the time, and that question is, what were your camera settings for that shot? When somebody asks me that, I know it means they don't really understand studio lighting. And so what I want to do today is explain how your camera settings affect your shots in the studio. Now, I'm going to be covering a lot of different pieces of information. Might be a little bit difficult to digest. And so if you want to dive into this a little bit more, I have an entire class with more than 15 hours of video dedicated to everything you could ever want to know about studio lighting. And the class is called Master Studio Lighting, where I walk you through getting the right exposure and the right camera settings and understanding when these certain camera settings are going to affect your shot. I walk through that step by step in that video. But for now, I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview to help answer why that question plagues so many people and why it's not really that important. So, we all know when it comes to our camera's exposure, there are three different things that affect the exposure. The first one is your shutter speed. The next one is your aperture, and then the last one is your ISO. And so I'd like to take you through those three elements and show you how they affect your images in the studio. So let's begin with your shutter speed. All right, so if you're shooting outside in ambient light, natural light, and you adjust your shutter speed, you'll see that the exposure changes. Slower shutter speed lets in more light, faster shutter speed lets in less light. These are the essentials of exposure. However, it doesn't work like that in the studio. In fact, your shutter speed, take it and forget about it. It doesn't matter. Kind of, like within reason. All right, so here's the thing. One of the things you have to consider is that every camera has a sync speed. It's basically the maximum shutter speed that you're allowed to shoot at in the studio before you'll start to see your black bars. Basically, the strobe and the shutters of your camera, they interfere, and so you'll see the little black strips. Every camera is different. My camera is 1/200th of a second. Today I'm going to be shooting with the Canon R5. So do your research, figure out what your sync speed is, and do not exceed, do not go above that sync speed. Now, what about slower shutter speeds? Well, it doesn't really matter if I shoot at 1/125th of a second, 1/200th of a second. None of that will affect the exposure. Where it will matter is if I shoot at such a slow shutter speed, like let's talk about like 1/8 of a second, it doesn't affect the light coming from this strobe. It doesn't change that exposure. However, at such a slow shutter speed, you start to see ambient light. So if you have on overhead lights or window light at such a slow shutter speed, eventually that window light will start to show up. So let me demonstrate what I'm talking about. So let me set up a scenario for you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my main light and move it off to the side, and so it's just going to create a little bit of shadow and sculpting on the left-hand side of the face. Now imagine that you have a large window in the studio space you're shooting. Maybe you're just shooting in your living room. So we're going to simulate the effect of this window by bringing in a daylight balanced LED light source. So this is not going to flash. It is a constant light source. So if your subject is sitting right next to a window, there's going to be ambient, constant light coming in. I want to take you through and show you how our shutter speed is going to affect whether that window changes our shot. All right, so let's start with our camera's sync speed. We're going to start with 1/200th of a second. When I take this shot, you'll notice that the left-hand side of her face, it's still dark. There isn't any detail there. You don't see the window light. All right, now let's drop down to 1/125th of a second. Still pretty good, not really seeing any ambient light. All right, now let's go to 1/60th of a second. Maybe you see a little bit of a change, a little bit of fill light, but not too much. All right, now, when we drop down to 1/30th of a second, you're starting to see a lot more light registering. You're seeing a little bit of shine on her face, even more at 1/15th of a second. And then at 1/8th of a second, man, you've eliminated the shadows and it is super bright. But throughout all of these shots, one of the things you should notice is that the exposure of the light from the strobe has not changed at all. The light on the right-hand side of the frame that is lighting her face, the actual flashing strobe, that exposure is completely unaffected. So in other words, what you should take away from this is that your camera's shutter speed does not affect flash or strobe exposure at all. You just have to keep it in mind for whether you're seeing your ambient light. So we have shutter speed under control. Let's move on to ISO. Now, ISO actually works the same way as it does out on location. Basically, how sensitive is your camera to light? Now, I typically am shooting somewhere around ISO 200 or 400 in the studio, and basically this is because it gives me a nice clean file. But let's say you're shooting in the studio with a light source that is not as powerful. Maybe you're shooting with, let's say, a speed light. Well, maybe shooting more at ISO 800 or 1000 is going to allow you a little bit more flexibility because those light sources don't quite put out as much light. Now, why does all of this matter, or what do you have to consider? How do you choose whether you shoot at ISO 200 or 1000? Well, what I would do is I would test with your camera in the studio. At what point do you raise your ISO so much that you start to see a little bit of noise that maybe you don't like? It all depends on your camera. It all depends on your preferences. What I do is I'll stick at ISO 200, and then if I'm looking and I need more light, I need more sensitivity, I'll bump up to ISO 400. No problem, it's still a nice clean file. Maybe even ISO 800. And if I'm at ISO 200 and the picture is too bright and I want to darken it down a bit, no problem, I just drop from 200 to 100. So it's really a range. Most of the time though, if you see one of my shots, it's probably at 200. So let's talk about aperture. Now, when you're on location, aperture not only affects exposure, but it also affects depth of field. And guess what? Same thing in the studio. If you use a wider aperture and you open up, of course, your light is going to appear brighter, but it also affects your depth of field. Now, here's the thing. In the studio, sometimes your depth of field doesn't really matter that much. For example, if you're shooting on a plain white background, if you're shooting wide open, or if you're shooting at f/16, you won't see that big of a difference. Now, shooting on a canvas background with a little bit of texture here, maybe instead of shooting at f11, you'd prefer to shoot somewhere at, let's say, f2.8, just to soften that background a little bit. It's all about your preference. But in the studio, the depth of field you shoot at, it's not as noticeable. It doesn't make as big a difference as it would if you're out on location and you're trying to reduce or soften an entire scene. All right, so now you all understand how shutter speed, aperture, and ISO affect your exposure and your shot in the studio. So now I want to talk about something called equivalent exposures. If you're unfamiliar, you should definitely do a little bit more research and get familiar because it is super useful. And fundamentally, it's the concept that whether you're shooting on location or the studio, you can balance those three settings to get the same exposure. So in other words, here we can juggle the aperture and the ISO and change them to create a balance and get the same or correct exposure. All right, so what does this mean? Let me show you an example. All right, so in this shot, I'm shooting at f11 and ISO 800. All right, now I'm not going to change the light. I'm not going to make any difference at all. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to shoot at f8 and ISO 400. See how the exposure hasn't changed. The shot looks identical. All right, so now we're going to go from f8 to f5.6, from ISO 400 down to ISO 200. Take a look at the shot. Exposure looks the same. And now finally, we're going to go from f5.6 to f4.0. We're going to go from ISO 200 to ISO 100. If you compare these shots, the exposure in all of them looks identical. It is the balance of both your aperture and your ISO that allows you to control the exposure in the studio. However, it doesn't really affect the look of the shot. The only place that you will see a difference is in that aperture. So if we zoom in close, for example, comparing the shot at f11 and the shot at f4, you will notice that there is a little bit of fall off of depth of field. The background and the side of the subject's face appears a little bit softer. So does that matter to your shot stylistically? Or are you trying to blur out the background? Or is it something you wouldn't notice at all? All right, so we've gone through this whole video, and the point is that your camera's settings don't matter as much as you think they do. And so the question is, what actually matters? When you're looking at an image and you want to understand the lighting and understand the shot, it's not all about the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO. What should really matter is, what modifiers were you using? The placement of light. Maybe the power of those strobes relative to one another. Those are the questions you should be asking. But if I tell you my camera settings, I'm not really revealing anything about my image. And by the way, just so those of you who might want to know, usually my default, just in case you actually do care, is 1/200th of a second, ISO 200, f11. That's my starting point, but guess what? I can go all over the place, and it just depends on the image. All right, guys, so I hope this is really helpful in getting your mind to wrap around how your exposure is affected in the studio by your camera settings. Now, if you want to learn a whole lot more about studio lighting, and I'm talking about the ins and outs, starting from no knowledge all the way up to being able to control and understand 3 different strobes, well, you're going to want to check out my class, Master Studio Lighting. And of course, if you want to see the gear used in the making of this video and you want to see the links, be sure to check out the description below and visit adorama.com. So guys, be sure to subscribe because I have so many more videos about lighting coming your way. See you next time.